Stop scrolling for 20 seconds, because what I am about to show you destroys one of the most viral stories on the internet with something physical, measurable, and impossible to argue away. In January 2025, a drilling team in East Antarctica pulled up a core of ice nearly 2,800 meters long after years of cutting through frozen history. Trapped inside that core were tiny bubbles of ancient air, sealed more than 1.2 million years ago. Not guessed, not dramatized, not reconstructed for a documentary. Directly dated. Frozen atmosphere from a world that existed long before human civilization ever appeared. And once you understand what that means, one of the most seductive Antarctica theories online does not merely weaken. It collapses. If you care about what is real beneath the ice, subscribe now, leave a comment with the word ice, and stay with me to the end. Because the true story is not smaller than the myth. It is darker, more human, and far more unsettling. You have probably heard some version of the claim already. It spreads because it is shaped perfectly for the modern internet. Antarctica, they say, was not always frozen. Ancient maps allegedly prove the continent was visible, maybe even ice-free, within historical memory. Some versions place the change shockingly late, as recently as the early 19th century. Then comes the catastrophe. A sudden planetary event, a pole shift, a volcanic winter, a hidden war. Something connected, perhaps, to 1816, the year without a summer. In this telling, an advanced civilization, often folded into the Tartaria narrative, was buried beneath the Antarctic ice, and an international treaty signed by dozens of nations now exists, not to preserve peace, but to conceal the truth. It is dramatic. It feels rebellious. It offers the pleasure of secret knowledge, and that is why it survives. But when you pull on the thread, you discover that almost every version of this story depends on the same recycled chain of errors, repeated so many times that repetition itself starts to feel like proof. The story usually begins with old maps, because old maps carry an emotional force that modern evidence does not. They look ancient, mysterious, authoritative. They feel like artifacts from a world that knew things we have forgotten. And among those maps, one is cited more than any other. The Piri Reis map of 1513. It was created by Ottoman Admiral Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, known as Piri Reis, and compiled from a range of earlier sources, including Portuguese charts, Arab materials, and, according to the mapmaker himself, a source connected to Columbus. It disappeared into the archives of Topkapi Palace and was only rediscovered in 1929. That alone is enough to make the imagination light up. Then someone points to the southern section and says, "There it is, Antarctica, charted 3 centuries before its official discovery." But the map contains its own rebuttal. Written directly on the chart in Ottoman Turkish is a description of the southern landmass. It says the place is uninhabited, in ruin, and inhabited by large snakes. It also says Portuguese sailors did not land there because it was very hot. Very hot. That detail alone should end the argument. Antarctica is not hot. Antarctica is not a serpent-filled wasteland. The mapmaker was not secretly sketching an ice-covered continent at the bottom of the globe. He was describing something else entirely. Once you step away from internet overlays and return to the actual history of cartography, the picture becomes much less mystical and much more familiar. Early 16th century maps often warped southern South America. Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego were frequently stretched, bent, or twisted to fit the available space on parchment. Coastlines curved unnaturally. Unknown southern land was blended with known coast. What modern conspiracy content treats as a vanished continent is far more likely a distorted rendering of South America's lower extremities, exactly as several serious historians of cartography have concluded. The second map usually brought forward is the Orontius Phineus map of 1531. At first glance, this one appears stronger. It shows a great southern landmass wrapped around the South Pole. It contains bays and shapes that people online love to compare with modern Antarctica. It looks convincing in still images, and even more convincing in dramatic montage videos with ominous music. But once again, context destroys the illusion. Laurent Fine, the French mathematician who created it, labeled the southern continent Terra Australis, not hidden Antarctica, not a revealed prehistoric survey. Terra Australis was a long-standing geographical idea, a speculative balancing continent that many scholars of the time expected to exist in the far south. The label on the map indicates it was recently discovered but not yet fully known. Language that reflects 16th century speculation following Magellan's voyage and the widening European awareness of southern waters. It does not indicate direct measurement of Antarctica beneath the ice. It indicates theory, inference, and imagination working with incomplete information. This is the part internet retellings almost never mention. The famous connection between these maps and an allegedly ice-free Antarctica did not emerge organically from the 16th century. It was filtered through a modern interpreter. One man, more than anyone else, pushed these maps into conspiracy culture: Charles Hapgood. In 1965, he published Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, arguing that ancient peoples had charted the globe, including an ice-free Antarctica, long before conventional history allows. His ideas became the seedbed for decades of alternative history media. They passed into the work of later authors, television specials, blog ecosystems, YouTube essays, and now short-form algorithmic content. Many people presenting the Antarctica map theory today are not really drawing from Piri, Reis, or Orans Fine. They are drawing from Hapgood, often without knowing they are doing it. And Hapgood's argument only works if you force the evidence to behave. To make the finalized map resemble Antarctica, you must rotate the landmass. You must shift the pole. You must ignore scale problems so large that the depicted continent becomes dramatically oversized. You must overlook the missing Antarctic peninsula, one of the most distinctive features of the entire continent. You must pretend a speculative Renaissance southern continent is a precision survey. The theory does not emerge naturally from the maps. It is imposed onto them. At this point, many people stop. The maps are wrong. Case closed. But that answer, while technically satisfying, misses the reason this subject keeps returning. Because the deeper question was never really about whether 16th century cartographers knew modern Antarctica. The deeper question is why Antarctica's official story feels so thin in the first place. Why a continent so vast seems to appear so abruptly in the record. Why the timeline feels incomplete. Why there is a strange hollowness in the standard version, as though entire chapters have been collapsed into a footnote. That feeling is real. It just points to a different silence than the one the conspiracy claims. The forgotten key is not a buried civilization. It is an erased industry. In the late 18th century, sealing exploded across the Southern Ocean. What drove it was fashion, commerce, and industrial appetite. Fur seals possessed a dense underfur that could be processed into material prized in the global clothing market. As demand grew, ships from Britain, Europe, and North America pushed into increasingly remote waters searching for colonies to harvest. And harvest is too soft a word. This was slaughter on a massive scale. Island after island was stripped. A new rookery would be found. Ships would descend on it. Animals would be clubbed, skinned, rendered, and the beaches left littered with carcasses. Then, once the population collapsed, the fleet would move on. This cycle happened again and again. South Georgia, South Shetlands, remote sub-Antarctic islands. Wherever seals bred in vulnerable numbers, men turned geography into inventory. By the early 19th century, the destruction was so severe that some species were nearly wiped from entire regions. The Southern Ocean, which many modern retellings frame as an untouched mystery before heroic national expeditions arrived, had already become a commercial killing ground. That changes everything. Because Antarctica was not discovered in some clean, ceremonial moment by noble explorers stepping into the unknown for the first time. It was approached through profit, through competition, through ships desperate to push farther south because nearer grounds had already been exhausted. The reason so much early Antarctic history feels fragmented is that the men most responsible for expanding human knowledge of those waters were sealers, not scholars. They had every reason to hide what they knew. Hunting grounds were commercial secrets. A location shared was a location depleted. Routes were concealed. Sightings went unpublished. Informal knowledge circulated privately. In logbooks, conversations, instincts, and half-remembered bearings rather than official scientific records. So by the time multiple nations laid claim to Antarctic discovery in 1820, The Southern Ocean had already been pressured by decades of exploitation. That apparent sudden burst of discovery was not a coincidence, and not evidence of hidden coordination. It was the result of an economic frontier being driven outward by ecological collapse. Think about what that means. The official discovery story begins where the paperwork begins, not where the real movement south began. And those are not the same thing. William Smith's accidental sighting of the South Shetland Islands in 1819 helped trigger a rush. Sealers surged south. Russian commander Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen sighted ice shelves in January 1820. British naval officer Edward Bransfield saw the Trinity Peninsula the same month. American sealer Nathaniel Palmer encountered the region later that year while searching for fresh grounds. Online storytellers sometimes present this cluster of sightings as suspicious, almost coordinated, as though powerful states converged because they already knew what lay beyond the fog. But there is a more grounded answer. Fleets had been moving south for years under commercial pressure. As local seal populations crashed, further expansion was inevitable. Extinction drove geography. This is one of the great hidden truths in the story of Antarctica. Not that someone hid a lost empire, that an ecological massacre created the conditions for discovery, and later generations polished the brutality out of the narrative. The internet theory is wrong about ancient maps, but it is accidentally reacting to something genuine. The sense that the official story has been cleaned. And it has. That pattern continues into the 20th century. Consider Operation High Jump in 1946 and 1947. Another favorite object of speculation. 13 ships, dozens of aircraft, thousands of personnel, led, at least symbolically, by Admiral Richard Byrd, whose name has become a magnet for every Antarctic myth from hidden entrances to secret bases. In online mythology, High Jump becomes an expedition that discovered something impossible and came back damaged, silenced, or defeated. The imagery is irresistible. Military hardware, polar silence, post-war secrecy, classified records, and a remote landscape perfect for projection. But the real context is not mystical. It is geopolitical. The Second World War had just ended. The Cold War was forming. Strategic planners were rethinking global mobility, defense, and sovereignty in polar regions. Antarctica mattered because states feared being locked out of territory, resources, or military positioning. The mission involved training, aerial photography, logistical experiments, and the extension of national presence. That does not make it innocent. It makes it imperial. It was not a treasure hunt into the ruins of Tartaria. It was a show of power in a world reorganizing around military anxiety. And often the real truth is more chilling than the fantasy, because it is so ordinary in its motives. Profit, territory, strategic denial, prestige. Those are the engines that built modern history far more often than lost super civilizations ever did. The same applies to the Antarctic Treaty of 1959. Online, the treaty is often framed as suspicious in itself. How could so many countries agree unless they were hiding something? But this question only feels compelling if you erase what came right before. By the mid-20th century, territorial claims in Antarctica were becoming combustible. Britain, Chile, and Argentina had overlapping claims. National stations and patrols created flashpoints. There were direct confrontations. Warning shots were fired in disputed territory. This was not abstract diplomacy over an empty map. It was the early stage of conflict in a strategically sensitive region. The treaty was not a planetary non-disclosure agreement. It was a mechanism to stop Antarctica from becoming another theater of military escalation. It froze sovereignty disputes, restricted military use, prohibited nuclear testing, and protected scientific cooperation. Again, the true story is not cleaner than the myth. It is simply political instead of fantastical. Then there is the claim that ordinary people cannot go to Antarctica, as if the continent is completely sealed off by a wall of governments guarding the entrance to forbidden knowledge. That statement survives mostly because it sounds right to people who have never checked. In reality, commercial Antarctic tourism has existed for decades. Expedition cruises travel to the Antarctic Peninsula during the austral summer. Some visitors fly from South America to King George Island and embark from there. The journey is expensive, physically demanding, and limited by weather and logistics. But the continent is not closed in the absolute way conspiracy content often suggests. What is restricted are certain activities, sensitive sites, and access imposed by environmental and operational realities. That is not the same thing as a total ban. And now we reach the ice itself, because this is where the argument ends. Not rhetorically, physically. Modern Antarctic science has recovered evidence that cannot be reconciled with the idea of a continent flash frozen in recent centuries. Deep ice cores contain atmospheres trapped hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago. Not symbolic atmospheres. Actual ancient air. Each tiny bubble is a sealed sample from a past world, allowing scientists to measure greenhouse gases, temperature proxies, dust, volcanic signatures, and long-term climate rhythms across spans of time far beyond human civilization. The significance of the recent drilling breakthroughs is hard to overstate. Projects in East Antarctica have recovered extraordinarily old ice and continuous climate records extending back more than 1 million years. Other regions, such as the Allen Hills, have yielded ancient near-surface ice much older still, preserved by unusual glacial dynamics that bring deep material upward. Independent dating methods, including noble gases and isotopic analysis, anchor these findings in physical measurement. These are not storytelling devices. They are the geological equivalent of hard drives recovered from deep time. So when someone says Antarctica only froze recently, or that a sudden event in the early 19th century buried a continent full of ruins, they are not presenting an edgy alternative interpretation of ambiguous data. They are colliding head-on with direct evidence that the Antarctic ice sheet has persisted on immense timescales. The claim is not bold. It is impossible. You cannot produce million-year-old atmospheric bubbles inside a continent that supposedly froze in 1816. You cannot explain away continuous paleoclimate records by saying the maps looked interesting. You cannot compress deep glacial history into a modern catastrophe because the chemistry will not let you. The physics will not let you. The ice itself will not let you. And yet, even after saying all of that, I do not think the viral fascination with Antarctica is entirely foolish. Misled, yes. Distorted, absolutely. But not foolish. Because beneath the sensationalism is an instinct that there are still hidden chapters here. And that instinct is correct. Antarctica does contain real mysteries. The deep interior remains imperfectly mapped at high resolution. Beneath the ice lie mountain ranges, sediment basins, buried landscapes, and vast networks of subglacial water. Lake Vostok is real. So are hundreds of other subglacial lakes connected by drainage systems we are still trying to understand. Some of these hidden environments may have been isolated for immense spans of time. Others may preserve records of past climates, ancient ecosystems, or geological transitions that would transform how we understand Earth's history. There are also authentic cartographic mysteries. The lost source map Reis said he used for some of his compilation no longer exists. That is a real unknown. Not because it proves Antarctica was known. It does not. But because a vanished chart is still a vanished chart. An absence has a way of feeding speculation when institutions fail to tell the public what is genuinely interesting. This, I think, is where the internet goes wrong and why it keeps going wrong. It mistakes wonder for proof. It sees a mystery and rushes to complete it with a ready-made answer. But the difference between a real mystery and a conspiracy theory is not that one asks questions and the other does not. It is that a conspiracy begins by deciding the answer before the evidence is examined. A mystery remains open. A mystery can survive contact with facts. The true history of Antarctica is not a fairy tale about enlightened ancients buried beneath fresh ice. It is a record of greed, violence, silence, and discovery layered together in ways that make the official version feel incomplete because it is incomplete. Sealers hid routes to protect profits. States cloaked territorial ambitions in the language of science. Industrial slaughter was pushed out of public memory because it did not fit the heroic style of exploration history. Even now, the continent is a strange mixture of cooperation and competition, fragile environmental stewardship and national presence, scientific revelation and political performance. That is the darker story. Not that the ice covers a lost empire everyone secretly knows about. That human beings have repeatedly approached the edge of the unknown with the same motives they carry everywhere else, then rewritten the record afterward to look nobler than they were. And still, for all of that, Antarctica remains extraordinary without any invented civilization. Think about what the ice actually is. layer upon layer of winters older than language, snowfall compressed into crystal archives, volcanic ash from eruptions no human ever witnessed, atmospheric traces from worlds separated by glacial cycles, trapped in bubbles smaller than grains of rice, a continent that preserves memory not in stone inscriptions, but in chemistry. We are drilling into time itself and pulling out air from ages before our species stood upright in anything like its current form. That is not less astonishing than the myth. It is more astonishing because it is true. The temptation of a theory like Tartaria in Antarctica is that it offers closure. It tells you what happened. It names the culprits. It wraps the cold white vastness in a story with villains and victims and a secret center. But reality is often less theatrical and more severe. The villains are ordinary human systems. Extraction, competition, prestige, state secrecy, historical amnesia. The victims are not only hypothetical civilizations. Sometimes they are millions of animals, erased coastlines of memory, and generations taught a simplified story because the real one was uglier. So yes, reject the impossible claims. Reject the flash freeze fantasy. Reject the manipulated map overlays and the lazy repetition that passes for research. But do not make the opposite mistake and think the continent is fully understood, fully narrated, fully exhausted. It is not. There are still buried landscapes under the ice. There are still ancient climate chapters waiting to be read. There are still logistical, political, and scientific frontiers that most people never hear about unless they go looking. The honest unknowns are more than enough. In the end, Antarctica does not need Tartaria to be haunting. It already is. A place first approached through commerce and blood, later fenced by power politics, and now studied through technologies precise enough to read the breath of ancient Earth. Beneath its surface are unanswered questions, but above all there is one answer already written with overwhelming clarity. This continent did not freeze in historical memory. It has been carrying deep time for millions of years. The ice says so. The air bubbles say so. The geology says so. And maybe that is the final reason this subject matters. Because the real lesson is not just about Antarctica. It is about how easily people will accept a thrilling explanation when official history has been thinned, sanitized, or stripped of its human cost. When institutions fail to tell the full truth, fantasy rushes in to occupy the silence. The cure is not cynicism. It is better history. Harder history. History willing to admit what prophet concealed, what governments reframed, and what the planet itself preserved despite us. The greatest archive on Earth is still under that ice. Not a library of stone temples. Not the streets of a hidden empire. Something stranger than that. A memory of climates, collapses, atmospheres, extinctions, and ages beyond the scale of civilization. We have only just begun to read it, and the more honestly we read it, the less we need myths to make Antarctica feel incredible. Because the truth is already immense, already terrifying, already beautiful, and it has been waiting under the ice all along.